Hi, so today we are going to study Pagsasaling Wika. This is a lecture on my notes on translation, colonialism, ideology, and practice. Let's look at the outline for today. So first, we're going to look at translation work in the Philippines, how it is to work with a translator, and then translation tips. Okay, first let's look at translation work in the Philippines. So what has been done so far? We're going to look at translation from European languages to Tagalog, and this was during the Spanish colonial period, and then English to Tagalog, and then after that, other languages to Filipino, and then other Filipino languages to Filipino. Then after that, other languages, not Filipino languages, to Filipino, and from Filipino to English. So here are the concepts that we're looking at today. Translation in colonialism, translation in ideology, translation in social movements, and translation in globalization. So before we start, I need to talk a little bit about the language itself and the script. As some of you may know, and some of you have maybe studied this in previous classes, the indigenous script is called the Baybayin, and here are examples of the letters of the Baybayin. But during the Spanish colonial period, a new system of writing was introduced, and thus the letters changed. So this was the Spanish orthography, and so these were the letters of the Spanish alphabet and the Tagalog alphabet in the 16th century. And then we lost the letter K at that period. The letter K was not used and was substituted by C, Q, and CQ. And it's important to remember all of these things because this will factor in when we look at the translations that were done during this period. Now you have then, however, what was interesting was while K was not used and it was replaced by C or Q, if you actually look at the name of the revolutionary organization which instigated the revolution in 1896, the name was KKK, which doesn't mean Ku Klux Klan, but as many of you may know, it's Kataas-Taasan Kagalang-Galangang Katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan or KKK. Now, this would again change because of the 1935 Constitution. So I'm just going to go through this constitutional provisions very quickly because some of you know this. But what I'm trying to say is that because of these constitutional provisions, right, the letters of the alphabet keep changing, and this mattered because when people were writing or editing or translating, you would see that they would use different letters all throughout the years. So what do we need to remember? You only need to remember that it was in 1935 that a common national language started to be developed. It was based on Filipino. And that in 1937, the Surian ng Wikang Pambansa or the Institute of National Language was formed, and it was this Institute of National Language that set about the standardization of the language that would later be known as Filipino. And they chose Tagalog to be the basis for the national language because of the following reasons. One, it was widely spoken. It's the language most understood in all the regions of the Philippines. It's not divided into smaller separate languages as Visayan is. Its literary tradition is the richest and the most developed and extensive. Tagalog has always been the language of Manila. And fifth, Tagalog is the language of the Revolution and the Katipunan. Now, let's look at the developments. What happened? So the language was standardized. There was a new orthography, specifically the comeback of the letters K and W. The guidelines for Tagalog grammar became studied in school, and in 1959, the Department of Education issued a memorandum, and this memorandum specified that a national language called Filipino would be taught in all elementary and high schools. Now, then again, you would have yet another change because of the second constitutional provision. This would be in 1973 after the declaration of martial law. And what it says was, the Constitution shall be officially promulgated in English and in Filipino and translated into each dialect spoken by over 50,000 people and into Spanish and Arabic. Until otherwise provided by law, English and Filipino shall be the official languages. Now, why is this important? Why is this fact important? Because this was the first time that the Constitution was translated into, not only into Filipino, but in other Philippine languages, making it accessible. So this was important because previously the Filipinos had no idea what the Constitution was about, because many of them did not read or speak English, right? And so it was important that there was a mandate to translate the Constitution for the people to be familiar with the laws of the land. Now, we now go to the third constitutional provision. And this was because of the 1987 Constitution. And according to this Constitution, the national language of the Philippines is Filipino. Note the use of the letter F. And as it evolves, it shall be further developed and enriched on the basis of existing Philippine and other language. So you would have new letters introduced in Filipino. So let's move on. Okay. So some of the materials that I've used here come from this text by Lilia Antonio. And Lilia Antonio then published had published a history of translation in the Philippines, and she entitled it Apat na Siglo ng Pagsasalin, or 4 Centuries of Translation. This was from 1593 to 1898, and this was published by the Filipino Language Center, or the Sentro ng Wikang Pambansa of the University of the Philippines.